Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to run you through the process of building all-in-one micro shop. If you don't know what it is, I assume you haven't seen the YouTube video made by 1 Minute Workbench, which I strongly recommend if you are into DIY projects. It is a compact all-in-one workshop which by the looks of it can do many useful things. It consists of a table saw, drill press, disc sander, router table, jigsaw. It is a lot if you consider the amount of space it requires. If you are a proper woodworker and already have your own workshop, it is unlikely to spark your interest, but if you are anything like me with no workspace other than a tiny garden, you are going to love the idea. I'm not going to focus on all details of the build as it's all very well covered by Tommy in his original video. But I would like to give you an idea of what the process is going to look like from the perspective of a newbie woodworker, including all mistakes I've made along the way, mostly due to not studying the instructions with enough patience. So let's see. I started with picking up the plans and printing some of them out, mostly the markings and elements dimensions. Anything else I decided to read from my laptop screen as I go. By the way, these are very clean and detailed, which proved really helpful throughout the process. I ordered 2 sheets of exterior grade plywood from local timber supplier, and I was lucky enough they pre-cut them for me according to the plans, so I could bring them home using a regular car. As I mentioned before, the goal is to build it regardless of what working conditions are at your disposal, so I had to figure out my epic working space in my garden using some rubber gym mats. I started carefully marking elements of the main body, following the plan. Since I'm pretty new to any kind of woodworking, it took me ages, but I like how the process took less and less time with every element I completed. In this case, precision is crucial as there's no point to build tools not accurate enough. One mistake can make your table saw cutting uneven elements, which is kind of useless. I also made sure to mark each element with a corresponding letter so that the final assembly is much easier. Soon enough, all main element markings were ready and I needed to cut them as perfectly as I could. Again, a table saw was not an option for me. In order to assure my cuts are close enough to perfection, I put together a quick saw track, also inspired by Tommy, which works with the circular saw I purchased specifically for this project, and needless to say, it's the first time I'm using that kind of tool, so it's going to be interesting. As a temporary worktop, I used my favorite wooden pallet and some clamps to hold the piece of plywood in place. I was happy, not to say surprised, with the quality of my cuts, considering how primitive my working conditions are. I carried on and soon I was equipped with all main elements cut to size. That was the end of day 1 of building the micro shop. The next step was to mark all the internal cuts on each of the main body elements. This process is similar to what you have already seen, and also it is fairly repetitive, so I tried to shorten it as much as possible. If you feel puzzled about the way I decided to draw this small circle, you must know I was simply too lazy to search for my caliper. I decided to go and find it later on, and that turned out to be the right thing to do in terms of time saving. One interesting feature here were these rounded corners, which I figured I can mark with a spade drill bits using a little hole they happen to have. I'm not sure if they are meant to be used that way, but in my case it turned out pretty precise and I was happy with the result. It is common knowledge, but cutting any openings from both sides often helps reducing the tear out. At this point I was forced to put my drill on charge and decided to use this old school brace, mostly because I don't get to use it too often, and it is a good workout as well. I carried on drilling all the corner holes for each of the main body elements using the same technique mentioned before. At this point I was ready to start cutting the internal openings using a jigsaw. Since I don't trust my jigsaw skills that much, I decided to use some sort of a guideline made from a simple steel profile which looked promisingly straight. it worked out acceptably great. It is worth mentioning that saving as much scraps as possible from cutting these little windows is a good idea, as there will be many opportunities to reuse them for smaller elements like knobs or support pieces. When I was finally done with the jigsaw, I put my freshly cut elements together, and with a lot of hope I started verifying if they all match. It seemed okay. Using a strap clamp, I made this much easier task. At this point, I was ready to start marking pilot holes for screws to hold the main body together. Using a piece of scrap plywood, I made sure they would go exactly in the center of the board's side. Obviously, it's important to verify squareness of the whole box every time I move any of the elements, and clamping a square in the corner made it a child's play. With screws in place, it was safe to remove the clamps and see if the main body holds together. By the way, there are at least two differences to the original video that I can think of. Firstly, you can see that I have marked but never cut the circular elements. This is because the delivery of my new hand router was delayed, but I didn't want to wait with the whole build. It surely made things a little bit more difficult due to limited space later on inside the box, but it was still doable. I would recommend to get these cuts done as early as possible in the process if you have a router on hand. The other operation I deferred was cutting out the two little holes for a material support arm on the side of the box, as at this point I wasn't sure what diameter my steel conduit is going to be. Later on, I purchased a slightly wider one compared to what Tommy used in his video, and I ended up modifying the position and size of the holes to my needs. Unfortunately, I don't think I caught that moment on camera. When I made sure all main elements make sense together, it was time for a glue up. Again, I used my amazing wooden pallet and disassembled the box. I glued each side edge by edge and left it to dry overnight with the strap clamp on just for safety. couple of screws I used made sure the box elements all came back to the exact same positions with the glue on. And that's it for this part. I guess you can say I'm a bit of a slow worker, but after 2 days I've had the main body shape pretty much done and I was happy with the progress. Stay tuned for the next part where I think I'm going to include some of the mistakes I've made later in the build and how I managed to rectify them.